Peter went out and wept bitterly. That's got to be one of the saddest verses in the whole Bible. Of all the tears that you can cry, bitter tears are the worst. With tears of grief, at least you carry within your heart the love that you feel for the person that you've lost or the person that you're saying goodbye to. But with tears of bitterness, you carry in with you all of that shame and humiliation and deep regret that stings your eyes like vinegar. Peter went out and wept bitterly. I wonder if for the rest of his life, Peter, whenever he heard a rooster crow, it took him right back to that very night. Sounds can do that, can't they? When I was a boy, I knew a man who had served in World War II, and he would never go with us to the 4th of July fireworks because when he heard them, he'd have this visceral reaction and flashbacks whenever he heard the sound of rockets bursting in the air. When I was in seminary, I spent a year working as a hospital chaplain, and after that, when I was a chaplain, I'd have to go to these situations of crisis in the emergency room, and I never knew what I was going to. And for several months after that, whenever I heard somebody's pager going off, do-do-do-do-do, do-do-do-do-do. Remember that old pager sound? Whether I heard it on riding on the bus or in the grocery store, I could feel this rush of adrenaline in my chest like I was going to be summoned to the emergency room to an unknown situation of crisis. And I'd have to catch my breath and remember that sound no longer has anything to do with me. I imagine there are sounds that jog your own memories and that take you back in time. The sound of a school bell ringing, of rain falling hard on the roof, a baby crying, an ambulance siren, the song that you loved when you were 16 years old. And I'll bet Peter never heard the sound of a rooster crowing in the same way again. Well, at the beginning of the story that we've heard today, Peter is following Jesus from a distance. He's following. The first time we hear that verb in the Gospel of Luke, it's also Peter who is following. It was a sunny morning on the shores of Lake Galilee. It was 1,000,000 miles away from this bitter midnight in Jerusalem. It's when he meets Jesus for the first time, and he'd been out fishing with his brother Andrew all night, and the air is fresh and full of newness when they haul their catch to the shore, the biggest catch they've ever caught in their lives. But Peter walks away from it all. The nets, the boats, their livelihood. He walks away from it all and follows Jesus. It was the start of an adventure. Life was full of new possibilities, and Peter, more than any of the other disciples, believed in Jesus, and he said it again and again. He was convinced that Jesus was the Messiah. Jesus was the one that God had sent to turn the world upside down and make things right. Peter and Jesus became the best of friends. Peter was part of the inner circle. Jesus even gave him a nickname. He called him Rocky. That's what Peter means in Greek, rock. And Rocky even walked on water. You remember that story? He walked on water at least for a few moments with Jesus until he started to sink. Nobody's perfect. But Rocky continued to believe in the power of positive thinking. He followed Jesus for 3 years, and he was right there by Jesus' side when they came riding into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And he said that if even all the other disciples abandoned Jesus, he would never abandon him. He would fight to the death if he had to. You know, the disciple that Matt preached about last week, the one who was in the garden when the soldiers came to arrest Jesus and pulled out his sword and cut off one of their ears, that was Rocky. But now after the arrest, Peter is getting further and further away from Jesus. He's following from a distance. Stanley Hauerwas notes that at a distance is a wonderful description for the way that most of us follow Jesus. So what changed for Peter? How did Rocky become rubble? I used to think he denied knowing Jesus because he was a coward. His fear got the best of him and he was trying to save his own skin, and there might have been some of that going on. But a coward doesn't take up a sword against a band of soldiers. Peter denied knowing Jesus because he realized for the first time that he did not know Jesus at all. When Jesus was arrested, Jesus didn't struggle or run. He refused to defend himself. He didn't put up a fight. This was not at all the Messiah that Peter thought he'd be. In denying Jesus, he was telling the truth. Peter was wrong. Jesus was not the man he thought he was. Now, I hate to be wrong. And when you get things wrong about God in your head, it affects the way you live. It affects the way that you even understand the world. Fred Phelps, the preacher who lived with a hate-filled picket sign in one hand and a Bible in the other, died 10 days ago. Did you read about that? And I know that when he met his maker, Fred Phelps found out that he was wrong. On the day Phelps died, one commentator wrote, "Today Fred Phelps discovered that God is love." I'm certain we all believe things about God that are wrong. I know this because I've been wrong many times myself. Now, Matt, when he gets up to preach, prays a wonderful prayer before every sermon. And I have to tell you, I pray a prayer too before every sermon, but I do so silently. Today, I'm going to tell you the prayer that I pray. This is how it goes. Lord, whatever I say that truly points to you, help it to stick. But whatever I say that's total rubbish, let it go right past him and out the door. Amen. Now you know my preacher's prayer. Maybe I should say it out loud whenever I preach. We're human. We get things wrong. And Christians over the centuries have gotten things very, very wrong, and you know the list all too well. Slavery, keeping women silent, violent crusades against Muslims, the extermination of native peoples. God didn't endorse any of that. We did, in God's name. And boy, were we wrong. Wrong ideas about God can destroy lives. My partner, Joe, gave me permission to tell you a story about a time when he was wrong. It's the only time he's ever been wrong. It's when he came out of the closet. He was just 18 years old, and he was living in a small town in upstate New York, and it was rough. He lost his job because of it. His relationship with his parents became very strained. He got beat up in the parking lot of a shopping mall. He went to church looking for some comfort, looking for support, but when he went down the aisle to receive communion, the priest said to him, "I won't serve you. You're not welcome here." And Joe walked out the door and never went back. And he walked out the door believing that he had been rejected by God. Well, 15 years later, he went into a welcoming church, and he found out that he was wrong. The pastor was preaching on John 3:16 that Sunday, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." And in his sermon, the pastor focused on that word, whoever. Everyone, no exceptions. Whoever, everyone is included. No one is left out. And it hit Joe right in his heart at that moment that what he had believed about God was wrong. Peter was wrong about what God was doing in the world through Jesus. If Jesus had fought back and saved himself from the cross, like a lot of us hoped he would do, he would not have saved anyone but himself. But in taking our pain and drinking to the full the suffering and violence of our world, God enters fully into human life and redeems us all, even the ones who put God to death. No one is left out. Now, this story takes place on the night that we know of as Good Friday. But today's not Good Friday. We do not have to leave Peter sitting outside in the dark, weeping bitterly with the sound of the cock crowing still ringing in his ears. We live after Easter. This is not the end of Peter's story. The worst that you have ever done in your life is not the end of your story. A few days after this night of bitter tears, Rocky is back where it all began, at the Sea of Galilee. And he's with some of the other disciples, and he says to them, "Let's go fishing." And they go out and they fish all night, and they don't catch a thing. But at dawn, when the world is fresh and new and young again, there on the beach, there's somebody standing. He calls out to them, and he says, "Throw your nets over onto the other side of the boat." And they do. And they pull them up, and they are bursting with fish. Then one of the disciples says, "It's the Lord." And Peter jumps into the lake and he swims to shore, and when he gets to the beach, he finds that there's a fire there, and there's fish broiling on the fire, and there's bread, and Jesus is there, and he says to him, "Come and eat." And Peter knew the joy of being wrong. The God he was meeting in Jesus was not the God he expected or even the God that he thought he wanted, but this was the true God and true man that he needed. Peter wanted Jesus to put up a fight, save himself from the cross. But from the other side of Easter, the cross showed Peter the true heart of God. When God comes to save us in Jesus, God does not come in force or coercion or violence. God saves us through self-giving love. The last words that Peter hears Jesus say to him that morning are the very same words that he had heard several years earlier on that beach. Follow me. But this time, Peter understands. To follow Jesus means to follow in his way of self-giving love. So what became of Peter, this man who denied ever knowing Jesus at all? Rocky becomes the first pastor of First United Church of Jerusalem. It's surprising the sort of people that Jesus likes to use. Jesus just seems to make better use of people who know they have screwed up royally. People who have wept bitter tears. People who know how deeply they have been wrong. They are weak, but he is strong. Well, the cock's crow wasn't the last sound that was left ringing in Peter's ears. The sound that rang in his ears and that defined him and who he was for the rest of his life was the voice of the very one he had denied and who said to him, "Come and have breakfast and follow me." Amen.